then there are other places that are great people and they're not weird. And because I was raised in quiet churches. So going to an Assemblies of God church where it's flowing in the gifts of the Holy Spirit and Pentecostal or charismatic in nature, people don't lift their hands in the church that I grew up in. They don't shout out. They don't speak in tongues. Like the first time I went there was actually with my best friend when we were 13, the first year we met. That was the only time I was ever in that specific church, but I had been there when I was 13. And I remember thinking that these people were crazy, like loud, speaking when the pastor's praying. I didn't understand any of it. But that was one of the churches that we actually went to try out. And because I have two small boys and they had a great kids program, a big youth program, so it would be a good fit for a family. And we attended, and then we tried a few other churches, and we had set to go back on a specific Sunday. And the night before we went, I had this vivid dream. And I dreamt, it wasn't the lead pastor, it was one of the assistant pastors that I saw in the dream preaching. And when we got there on Sunday morning, it was the assistant pastor who was preaching. So already that was something to me. But in the dream, this assistant pastor kept telling me, Revelation's in the middle. And that was the only thing he spoke, Revelation's in the middle. And I said, it's not in the middle, it's at the end. Because I'm thinking, the Bible. He said, no, Revelation's in the middle. And I'm arguing. And it was such an intense argument in this dream that I woke up from the dream and I ended up going back to sleep. But then just, a few hours later, we're in church service. And the assistant pastor gets up and he's the one that's going to preach. And he says, in your bulletin, there's the sermon notes for today. And he read off the title of the sermon, and I opened the bulletin and I look at the sermon notes, and there's only 3 points and Revelation's in the middle. So right then I looked at Rhoda, who wasn't my wife at the time, and I said, this is our church. I hadn't told her about the dream or anything. I just told her, I said, this is the church. And later I told her what I had dreamt and all that. But that's when we decided that's where we were going to call our home church. We started going through premarital counseling. I ended up joining the choir, and we got highly involved in the church. We were still drinking here and there and going to the bar, and we weren't living a holy and righteous lifestyle. And because of circumstances, I actually had to change one room of the house to be a room for her because she couldn't stay in the place where she was because the ex-husband owned it and had massive debt, and it was a crazy situation where she had to declare bankruptcy, and it was not a good situation. So she didn't have any place to stay. And while I knew it wasn't right for her to live in the house before we got married, we compromised on that to where I made her own little apartment because there was a separate entrance on that side of the house because it used to be split into a duplex before I bought it. So she did live in the house for 7 months before we got married. But Rhoda was told for 15 years that she could never have children. And the doctors actually told her that even if she would conceive, she would never carry full term. So we ended up getting married, and then as soon as we got married, she became pregnant. And so obviously there was some fear there, but she carried full term, and it was the day before her due date. We went in for a routine doctor's appointment, and they couldn't find a heartbeat. So we're 1 day away from her due date. She carried the full 9 months, and So Xavier was born the next day, but he was stillborn. So the day that we went to the doctor's office and found out there was no heartbeat, they sent us over to the hospital to get an ultrasound done to confirm that there's no heartbeat. And then we get told, they have to induce her and she has to give birth. So I called our pastor and I told him what was going on. And he said, well, whatever time she gives birth, you call me. He said, I'll have my phone next to the bed and I'll come to the hospital. And it was early morning, 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the morning. And so I called him and he was at the hospital within 30 minutes. And he prayed with us and we were there. And that was a Friday. And Sunday morning, we were both in church. There's different moments in your life that you get to make a choice. Like you can shake your fist at God and be angry. When Xavier was born, Rhoda held him. She asked me if I wanted to hold him. I said no. And I stood there over the bassinet. Even though he was stillborn, they still wrap him in a blanket and bring him into the room. And so he's in the bassinet at the hospital. And I stood there and I touched him, but I wouldn't hold him. And it wasn't until later that she asked me, why won't you hold him? And I said, because I don't want to take a chance on being angry at God. Like, you carried this child and gave birth. It was like, but I'm expecting to hold a live child in my arms, and I just didn't want to take a chance on stirring my emotions up and becoming angry with God because God didn't kill him. And so Sunday morning, we were in church, and the pastor from the pulpit, he talked to us and he read about David. When David lost a child in the Bible, it says he was thankful when he could go into the house of the Lord. And so he was drawing the comparison between David and us. And he asked the church to come around us and pray. So we were in a church that seated about 600. And she and I stood up and everybody's coming around to lay hands. And the whole congregation gets up and comes. And I see this group of people on the opposite side of the sanctuary, maybe 20 people. And I'm like, that's weird. Why is there a clump of people that wouldn't come when the whole church came? And didn't think anything of it at that point. And after church, there was a gentleman that came over to me, and he said, I just wanted to let you know what happened during service. And I said, okay, what happened? And he said, there was a man, when pastor asked the church to pray for you, he said there was a man that just started weeping, like weeping. And he said, so some people came around to console him. He said, and then he told us that he had lost a child 9 years before. And he had never gone back to church until that day. Not only was the choice to go to church immediately our breakthrough, but it was his breakthrough.